Hey there folks, it's Blue here at Blue Bears Games, and for today's video, I will be showing you the newest addition to my budget commander decks that I make and sell on the Blue Bears Games Facebook page that is mono black and uses Syr Konrad the Grim as the commander. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to ask for your help in supporting my channel, which can be done in the following ways. Subscribing to the channel, sharing any of my content on your socials, watching some of my many other videos, purchasing super thanks, purchasing channel memberships, purchasing decks that you may have seen on this channel directly from me on the Blue Bears Games Facebook page, and/or visiting our sponsor at arcane-fortress.com and using discount code BLUEBEAR at checkout if you decide to purchase any of their amazing gaming supplies from them. Anything that you do will help support my channel immensely, and I thank you for it. Now that that is out of the way, let's get to today's video. So like I said, this build is mono black and uses Syr Konrad the Grim as the commander, so let me show you what it does real quick. Syr Konrad is 2 black and 3 generic mana to cast for a 5/4 legendary human knight with the following 2 abilities. The first ability says, whenever another creature dies, or a creature card is put into a graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, or a creature card leaves your graveyard, Syr Konrad the Grim deals 1 damage to each opponent. The second ability says that for each 1 black and 1 generic mana that you pay, each player mills a card. In parentheses, it explains that this means they each put the top card of their library into the graveyard. These 2 abilities together look like they would be fun to build around using creatures that were quote-unquote resilient, some sacrifice outlets, and lots of removal. So how did I fill out the rest of the 99, you may ask? Let me show you. So starting off with the lands for this deck, it's a monocolor deck, so there's not a lot of utility lands, but I do have a couple. So we're going to start off with Hidden Necropolis. It is a cave that enters the battlefield tapped. Taps to add a black, but then it has an ability for later in the game where you can pay 4 generic, a black, tapping it and sacking it to discover 4. And that's not entirely indicative of what this deck does. It's just more for the ability to get more cards into play for you. Mortuary Mire enters tapped, unfortunately, but when it does enter, you take a creature card from your graveyard and put it on top of your library, and of course it taps to add a black. Baron Moor, so late game, it'll be something you cycle away. Early game, you'll play it if it's like in your opening hand. So unfortunately, it comes in play tapped. Same thing with Polluted Mire, only now the cycling cost is 2 generic instead of 1 black. Gaia Reach Sanitarium is a legendary land. It doesn't come into play tapped. It taps to add a colorless, and then you can pay 2 and tap it to have each player draw a card, then discard a card. Remember, this deck is predicated on creature cards going to the graveyard, so if somebody discards a creature card, obviously, Syr Konrad will trigger, and that will deal damage. So now, not only are you drawing cards, you're possibly dealing damage, and then some of the creatures in this deck will have the ability to self-return, so discarding one of those is not so bad. Blighted Fen doesn't come into play tapped, taps to add a colorless, and then you can pay 5, tap and sack it to have an opponent sacrifice a creature. Sometimes that's needed. A lot of, things out there that have good protection, this gets around that. Encouraging Waste, because I always include 1 land in every deck that I make that's budget to destroy a non-basic land because you never know what's out there. Myriad Landscape to go and thin your deck out of land draws later. And then, of course, the same thing with Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse. The rest of it, I think it's 25 swamps because it's a monocolor deck, and what else am I going to do? Moving on to the ramp section of this deck, mono black means that most of my ramp would either be instants and sorceries that are one-shots or mana rocks or things of that sort. I'm not a fan of one-time uses, so I went with mana rocks and things that go and get lands. For instance, Renegade Map. It enters play tapped, but it only costs 1, so you can play it first turn if you don't have a land that comes into play tapped. And then you can tap it and sack it to go search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. And that just helps thin out your deck. And it's the same thing with the Traveler's Amulet, only now it doesn't come into play tapped, and it doesn't have to tap to be used. Wayfarer's Bauble does the same thing, only now it's 1 to cast, 2 and tap and sacking it instead of 1. And then you can search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, and put it onto the battlefield tapped. Felwar Stone, a lot of people play black, but I mean, this is not really going to matter. You're going to have there's no mana fixing in this, so this is basically going to be a colorless if you need it, or a black, hopefully, if your opponents are playing black. Mindstone, it's a 2 to cast. It doesn't come into play tapped, which is the whole point of it. It taps to add a colorless, and then later in the game, if you don't need it anymore, you can sack it to draw a card. Charcoal Diamond, another 2 to cast, only now it comes into play tapped and doesn't have anything other than the ability to tap for black. And then the last one's a little interesting of a choice. It's a 3 to cast mana rock, which I know, boo, but it doesn't come into play tapped. It only taps to add a colorless, but you also have the ability to pay 4 and tap it to investigate, which puts a clue token into play for you that can later be sacrificed to draw a card. So it's kind of like
delayed card draw for you. As far as the creatures go, there are 3 different types of creatures in this deck. The first section I'm going to show you are what I call self-returners. They can basically go from the graveyard back into either your hand or play, and it's usually by an ability that's in them, or it can do it for other things. The second section will be forced sacrifice creatures, and the third one will be utility. So up first, we have things like Clay Revenant, which is a 1 to cast 1/2 that enters the battlefield tapped, but when it's in your graveyard, you can pay 3 and return it to your hand at any time. So that's what I mean by self-returners. Persistent Specimen, another example of that. It's a 1 to cast 1/1. It does not enter play tapped, and you can pay 3, and you can return it from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Sanitarium Skeleton, 1 to cast 1/2. You pay 3 and return it from your graveyard to your hand. Haunt of the Dead Marshes, another 1 to cast 1/1. When it enters play, you get the Scry 1, so that's useful. And then for 3, you can return it from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped, but only activate it if you control a legendary creature. And the hope here is that you have Syr Konrad out, so that won't be an issue. Cult Conscript, another 1 to cast. This one's a 2/1 that enters play tapped, but you can pay 2 and return it from your graveyard to the battlefield, but only if you had a non-skeleton creature die this turn. There are a lot of skeletons in here, and this will somewhat be a quasi-skeleton tribal, if you will, but only because the skeletons are the ones that do most of the self-returning. Gutterbones, another 1 to cast 2/1. It enters play tapped, but you can pay 2 to return it from your graveyard to your hand, but only during your turn and only if an opponent lost life this turn. Hopefully with your commander, which is Syr Konrad here, a lot of the things that this deck does will help make your opponents lose life, so that shouldn't be an issue. Reassembling Skeleton, probably the best self-returner of all the self-returning creatures. That's not a rare. It is 2 to cast for a 1/1, and it's simply you just pay 2 to have it go from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. It does facilitate some infinite combos that you can incorporate in here if you purchase the deck. Durable Coilbug, it's just a 2 to cast 2/2 that 4/5 you can return from your graveyard to your hand. Obviously, going to be later game. Clattering Augur is a 2 to cast 1/1 that can't block, and then when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card and you lose a life, so that's a repeatable ability to draw cards because it also has an ability that says that you pay 4 and return it from your graveyard to your hand. Stinkweed Imp is a 3 cast 1/2 flyer, so it helps shore up some of that issue of not having flying creatures. And then it has this ability that says whenever it deals combat damage to a creature, destroy that creature. So it's actually not bad for blocking purposes. And then it has an ability called Dredge, and the Dredge on this is 5. And what Dredge means is that if you would draw a card, you instead mill 5 cards from the top of your library and put this card in your hand instead of drawing a card. And if for some reason you don't decide to do that, you draw the card instead. I don't know why that needs to be said, but it is. Skeleton Crew, 4 to cast 3/3. This one gives each other creature that you control that's a skeleton or a pirate, and the pirate doesn't matter here. This is, a lot more skeletons, and I think this is the only pirate in here. It gives them a static buff of +1/+1. And then whenever 1 or more creature cards leave your graveyard, you create a 2/2 black skeleton creature token. So in essence, they become 3/3s if Skeleton Crew's in play. And then later on in the game, you can pay 6 to return it from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So it can keep coming back. So it actually fits both parts of the theme here, because most of the creatures that self-return are skeletons, so this buffs them, and it self-returns itself. Whisper Blood Liturgist is a 4 to cast 2/2 that you can tap it and sacrifice 2 creatures to return target creature from your graveyard to the battlefield. And that's actually really good because a lot of your self-returners are what you're going to target to sacrifice, get them back later, and you'll get something that doesn't self-return back. Ghoulsteed is a 5 to cast 4/4 that you can pay 3 and discard 2 cards to return it from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. It seems kind of harsh to have to discard 2 cards, but remember, a lot of the cards that self-return, a lot of the creatures I just showed you, they go back to your hand and not into the battlefield. So you can just discard them to get this back too. Champion of Stray Souls. This one's a little more expensive, but this actually can be not exactly a win con, but and not entirely a bomb, but it's close. So it's 6 to cast for a 4/4 that has 2 abilities that really work in this deck. You pay 5, tap it, and sacrifice X other creatures to return X target creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. Now, mind you, Syr Konrad does damage whenever a creature dies, and also when a creature leaves your graveyard. So this does double damage when you do that. The other ability says for 7, you can put Champion of Stray Souls on top of your library from your graveyard. So not the greatest way of self-returning, but at least it has the ability to do so you can get that first ability multiple times if it dies. So that's the self-returners. Now we're going to do the forced sacrifice guys, and these should be pretty familiar to you. There's a bunch of these kind of creatures, so they all do something very similar. For instance, Playcrafter is a 3 to cast 3/2 that when it enters play, each player sacrifices a creature. This one also does or a planeswalker, and then each player who can't discards a card. Most of them don't do that. This is the only one that does those extra things, but the first part of it is what is the commonality. For instance, Demon's Disciple is a 3-cast 3/1 that when it enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a creature or planeswalker, and that's it. Merciless Executioner is a 3-cast 3/1 that when it enters play, each player sacrifices just a creature. Slum Reaper is a 40-cast 4/2 that when it enters play, each player sacrifices a creature. Chain Devil, a little bit different. It's a 40-cast 4/2 that says when it enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a non-token creature. And then the last one is going to be Rot Tide Gargantua. It's a 5-cast 5/4 with Exploit. And what Exploit means is that when it enters play, you can sacrifice a creature, and if you do, you get another ability. And this one says if you've exploited a creature, each opponent sacrifices a creature. It's almost exactly the same as the other creatures I just showed you, only now you get to choose whether or not you want to do it. It's that simple. And then utility, and this is going to look a little weird, but I'll explain it. The first one is Liliana's Devotee. It is a 3-cast 2/3 that gives zombie creatures you control +1/+0. This is not a zombie deck. However, there are ways to make more zombies, even on the card itself. So it says at the beginning of your end step, if a creature died this turn, you may pay 2, and if you do, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. The reason why I have this in here is because creatures will be dying all over the place with this deck, so the ability to create 2/2s, it's there a lot. It's also a nice way to have a secondary win con if you want to win by going wide with tokens, because this isn't the only one that does this. The next one does it too. This one is called Death Priest of Miracle. It is a 40-cast 2/2 that is a Lord again. Only this time, it gives skeletons, vampires, and zombies you control +1/+1 as a static buff. Remember, it's got a lot of skeletons in it, but now because of this card and Liliana's Devotee, you can get some more tokens in play that will also be buffed. Because at the beginning of your end step, if a creature died this turn, you may pay 1 generic mana, and if you do, you create a 1/1 black skeleton creature token. Bear in mind, there's another Lord, so to speak, of skeletons. So now if you've created a 1/1 skeleton, it can be a 3/3. If you created a 2/2 skeleton, it can be a 4/4 if both buffing lords are in play. Dreadhound. So this is like a really bad version of Syr Konrad the Grim. So this is like your secondary commander. It's like a hidden one. It's not a legendary creature, but it has most of what Syr Konrad does. It's 6 to cast for a 6/6. When it enters the battlefield, mill 3 cards, which isn't bad if Syr Konrad's on the battlefield, because if you mill some creatures over, he'll get to deal damage. And then whenever a creature dies, or a creature card is put into a graveyard from a library, each opponent loses a life. So it's got 2 out of 3 for what Syr Konrad does. It's not as good. It's a little bit bigger on stats. So this is if you're having a problem keeping your commander out, this is a secondary version of it. Vengeful Strangler is a 2 to cast 2/1 that can't block. And then it says whenever it dies, return it to the battlefield, transformed under your control, attached to target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls. So it comes back after it dies, so it goes to your graveyard, does the damage if Syr Konrad or the Dreadhound is in play, and then it leaves as a creature, and then on the battlefield it turns into Strangling Grasp, which says you enchant a creature or planeswalker that an opponent controls, and then it says at the beginning of your upkeep, enchanted permanent's controller sacrifices a non-land permanent and loses a life. So now, not only do they lose a life no matter what, but when they sacrifice a permanent, if it's not the permanent that this is enchanting, which most likely it will be, you also have repeatable ways to have Syr Konrad trigger because they'll just keep sacrificing things on your upkeep. Most likely, though, they're probably going to choose to sacrifice the permanent that this is enchanting. The last creature is an interesting one. It's called Undercity Informer. It's a 3-cast 2/3 that you pay 1 and sacrifice a creature, so it's a sack outlet, which is very, very needed. And then have target player reveal cards or mill cards from the top of their library until they reveal a land card and put them on the graveyard. So you have a repeatable way to get creatures back. You have a repeatable way to mill people, and then Syr Konrad does trigger on mill. That's why it's built into Syr Konrad, because whenever a creature card is put into the graveyard from the library, it deals damage. So this is a repeatable way to get damage in. Moving on to the instants and sorceries of this deck, it's split up into 2 sections. We have removal, and then we have ways of putting cards in your hand, and I say that instead of card draw, because not every card says draw cards. So I'll start off with the removal. It's pretty basic. It's as many things as I can find that were cheap enough to fit the budget, also cheap enough to cast. So we start with Doomblade. It destroys a non-black creature at instant speed. Go for the Throat. It destroys a non-artifact creature for 2 mana at instant speed. Extract a Confession. It's 2 to cast at sorcery speed. And as an additional cost to cast this spell, you may collect Evidence 6, which means that you may exile 6 cards from your graveyard, which you won't probably do because you want most of the stuff in there to stay there. And it says each opponent sacrifices a creature, And if evidence was collected, instead, each opponent sacrifices a creature with the greatest power among creatures they control. And again, you're probably just not going to collect the evidence, depending on what's going on. If you have a lot of stuff in the graveyard that you're not going to be able to get back, maybe you do. Feed the Swarm. It's an anomaly amongst this game that it's a black way to remove enchantments, but it destroys a creature or an enchantment, and then you lose life equal to that permanent's mana value. For 2 mana, it's really good, and it's sorcery speed. Walk the Plank is a 2-decay sorcery that destroys target non-merfolk creature, and unless somebody's playing a hackball deck, you're not really going to run into a lot of merfolk unless you go run into Thrasios. Assassinate destroys a tapped creature for 3, and Asphyxiate destroys an untapped creature for 3. Hero's Downfall destroys any target creature or planeswalker for 3 at instant speed. And then Price of Fame is a 4-cast instant that destroys target creature and lets you surveil 2. However, it will cost 2 less if you target a legendary creature, and Commander is specifically the one format where you're guaranteed to run into a legendary. Eviscerate is a 4-cast sorcery that just destroys target creature. Grisly Spectacle is a 4-cast instant that destroys target non-artifact creature, and then it has the player who controlled that creature mill 4 cards, which could equal damage if Syr Konrad is on the board. The rest of it's going to be quasi-board wipes, and I say quasi because actual creature board wipes in black are monetarily expensive, so I had to go on a budget. So it's things like this, which does negatives to their toughness and their power. So Pestilent Haze is a 3-cast sorcery where you get to choose to either have all creatures get -2/-2 until end of turn, or remove 2 loyalty counters from each planeswalker. So it does double duty at least. Drown in Sorrow, 3-cast sorcery that gives all creatures -2/-2 and lets you scry 1. Golden Demise is a 3-cast sorcery that gives you Ascend, which says that if you have 10 or more permanents in play, you gain the City's Blessing. And then it gives all creatures -2/-2 until end of turn, but if you have the City's Blessing, instead only creatures that your opponents control get -2/-2. Biting Rain is a 4-cast sorcery that gives all creatures -2/-2, or you can, if you have to discard a card, Gyre Reach Sanitarium comes to mind with this. If you have to discard it, you can instead pay 1 black and 2 for the madness cost to cast it. And then the big one is Languish. So Languish gives all creatures -4/-4 until end of turn. Look at the casting cost. It's exactly the same as Damnation. Damnation costs $20. This costs like $1. So that's why this is in there in its place. But if you end up buying the deck, that's the replacement you would make. Now we look at the stuff that puts cards in your hands. So we start off with Village Rites. It's the only card that's going to be like this. It's 1 black, it's an instant, and as an additional cost to cast a spell, you must sacrifice a creature, but it lets you draw 2 cards, so that's not bad. Then we have Blood Pact, 3-cast instant that target player draws 2 cards and loses 2 life. Painful Lessons, a 3-cast sorcery that has target player draw 2 cards and lose 2 life. Read the Bones, another 3-cast sorcery that does similarly to what the last 2 cards I just showed you do, except for now you get to scry 2, and you don't get to have target player do it. Foreboding Fruit, 3-cast. Again, target player draws 2 cards and loses 2 life, but this has Adamant, and Adamant means that if you paid 3 of whatever the color it is, so in this case, if you paid 3 black, you also get a food token, which could be useful because you need life sometimes. Unseal the Necropolis is a 3-cast instant that each player mills 3 cards. Remember, Syr Konrad does deal damage when creature cards are flipped over from being milled, so that could be damage, and if you're in a pot of 4, that could actually, it's not going to, but it could be up to 12 damage. And then you return up to 2 creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. And again, Syr Konrad can trigger from that, so that's maybe an additional 2. Dark Bargain is a 4-cast instant that lets you look at the top 3 cards of your library, put 2 of them into your hand and the other into your graveyard, and it deals 2 damage to you. Why is this in here? Okay, so you flip over 3 cards, and it's 2 lands and a Sanitarium Skeleton. You don't care about the skeleton. It goes to the graveyard, and you get 2 lands in your hand. Or something of that sort. You may flip over one of the cards that self-returns, so none of the cards are wasted. And then Diabolic Tutor, it's basically a twice the mana cost demonic tutor. It lets you go search your library for a card and put it in your hand and then shuffle. And then Final Parting. This is probably, in my opinion, one of the best tutors in Magic for what this deck wants to do. So for 5 mana, you search your library for 2 cards. You put one of them into your hand and the other into your graveyard and shuffle. So in the case of this deck, you'll go and search for a card that you really need in your hand, and then you search for one of the skeletons that returns later or one of the non-skeletons that returns by itself. And then there's nothing lost. You actually get 2 cards out of this. As far as the enchantments go, they're all utility. First up is Pheresis, which is a 2-cast aura enchantment. You enchant a creature, and that creature gains Infect. The point of this is to put it on Syr Konrad or Dreadhound, And then every time it deals damage, it's a poison counter, so now you only need to do damage 10 times. Then Ghoulish Procession, 2 to cast enchantment that says whenever one or more non-token creatures die, doesn't have to be your creatures, you create a 2/2 black zombie creature token with Decayed. Decayed zombies, there's purposes for them. They die when they attack, so Syr Konrad can actually trigger off of them attacking as well. And it's every turn, so it doesn't just mean your turn. So if creatures die on your opponent's turns, you get another one. It's good utility. It gives you more ways to go wide in this deck if your Syr Konrad strategy doesn't work. Agent of the Iron Throne, a 3 to cast legendary enchantment that's a background. We have nothing to do with backgrounds here. It's just an enchantment in this deck. And it says commander creatures you own have whenever an artifact or creature you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent loses a life. So it's just extra damage when Syr Konrad's on the board. The Long Reach of Night is a 4 to cast saga with 3 chapters. The first 2 chapters say each opponent sacrifices a creature unless they discard a card. And then, of course, the third chapter says to exile it and return it to the battlefield under your control, transformed. And it transformed into Animus of Night's Reach, which is a cool creature for this deck. So it's a 0/4 with Menace that says whenever it attacks, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn, where X is equal to the number of creature cards in that player's graveyard. So you're killing a lot of things in this deck. That's what the whole point of this deck is to make people get rid of their creatures, put them in their graveyard. This could get really big really fast. The last enchantment is the Eldest Reborn. It's a 5 to cast saga that has 3 chapters. Chapter 1 says each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker. Chapter 2 says each opponent discards a card. And then the third chapter says put target creature or planeswalker card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. A graveyard means it doesn't have to be any of your creatures. It could be an opponent's creature. And finally, the last 2 cards of this deck are
the artifacts.
The first one is Mirror Shield, which if you've seen any of my budget deck videos, you know that I put a Mirror Shield into every deck because it's basically just the budget version of a Lightning Greaves or a Swiftfoot Boots. And then Ashnod's Altar, because you need a free sack outlet that gives you some kind of benefit. This one lets you get 2 colorless mana for each creature that you sacrifice. It helps facilitate things dying so you can return them later.
And that, my friends, is how I built Syr Konrad the Grim on a $40 budget. As I said at the beginning of this video, this deck has now been added to my list of decks that are available for purchase on the Blue Bears Games Facebook page and the Facebook Marketplace. This build has some similarities to the budget Tormod deck that I make as well, but how they both win are very different. Tormod focuses more on a token-making go-wide combat strategy, while Syr Konrad focuses more on sacrificing your creatures, destroying opponents' creatures, and or milling your opponent's libraries to deal damage directly to them. Syr Konrad just feels like it causes more chaos throughout the game, and that's what I like about this deck. What do you think about it? Let me know in the comments. Well, folks, that's all for today, but if you're looking for more Magic content to watch, please go browse my channel and take a look at some of my many other videos. There's something for everybody, so I'm sure you'll find more videos that you'll enjoy. Before you go, though, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel so you can be notified when I release new content. I believe next week I will be going over a not-so-budget commander deck that I built for someone very special to me that uses a pretty popular commander, so you won't want to miss that. Anyway, have a great day, and I hope to see you all next Friday.